Before they fell in love, they signed a contract. The library at Thorn Manor smelled of old paper, lemon oil, and the faint, bitter tang of the encroaching sea. It was a massive, cavernous room built from heavy timber and native stone, a testament to the old money isolation of the Pacific Northwest. Outside the tall, leaded glass windows, the sky was a bruised and unrelenting gray, threatening a torrential downpour that had not yet broken. Inside, the silence had teeth. It was a thick, suffocating quiet, broken only by the rhythmic, scratching sound of a fountain pen moving across heavy vellum. I sat completely still in a high-backed leather chair, my hands folded perfectly in my lap, feeling the chill of the room seeping through the soles of my shoes. I was wearing a simple, dark dress. There was nothing resembling white, nothing suggesting a celebration, and certainly nothing speaking of romance. There was no music, no vows, just silence and the cold, unyielding reality of a transaction. Choices vanish quickly when you are poor. When your mother's medical bills have utterly drained the family accounts, and when your father leaves behind more debt than memories. The bank had called every single day for 6 months. The foreclosure notices had piled up like snowdrifts on the chipped counter of my childhood home. Then, Julian's lawyer had arrived with a ledger, a bank draft, and a proposition. Across the polished expanse of the mahogany table sat Julian Thorn. He was a man composed entirely of sharp angles and winter stone. His dark suit was immaculate, his posture rigid, and his expression as unreadable and vast as the ocean churning at the base of the cliffs outside his estate. He did not look at me. His gaze was fixed steadily on the thick document resting between us. Arthur Pendleton, the meticulous family attorney who had drafted this arrangement, stood at the head of the table. Pendleton was a man who trafficked in exactitudes and legal absolute, his voice a dry, clinical drone that stripped every ounce of humanity from the words he read. Clause 4, subsection B. Pendleton recited, sliding a silver-rimmed spectacle up the bridge of his nose. Pertaining to the division of the residential property. It is explicitly agreed that the primary residence, Thorn Manor, shall be divided to ensure complete physical autonomy. Mr. Julian Thorn shall maintain exclusive occupancy of the east wing and the master quarters. Miss Clara Vance, soon to be Mrs. Thorn, shall occupy the entirety of the west guest wing. Pendleton paused, tapping a manicured finger against the edge of the dark leather binder that held the document. The marriage covenant, he had called it. It felt more like a meticulously drawn blueprint for an elegant prison. The boundary between these respective quarters shall be respected at all times, Pendleton continued, his tone entirely devoid of inflection, treating our future like a corporate merger. There shall be no unannounced intrusions, no shared domestic obligations, and no expectation of physical proximity beyond what is strictly required for public appearances. Are these terms understood and accepted by both parties? Yes, Julian said. His voice was a low, resonant murmur that seemed to vibrate against the cold marble of the fireplace across the room. It was the first word he had spoken in an hour. He carried the scent of cedarwood and cold rain, a sharp, clean fragrance that filled the space between us but offered no warmth. Clara, Pendleton prompted, turning his sharp gaze toward me when I did not immediately mirror his robotic efficiency. Understood, I replied quietly, refusing to let my voice waver. I held onto my dignity like a shield, keeping my spine perfectly straight against the leather chair. I was an architectural archivist, a woman trained to look at the skeletal structure of collapsing buildings and find the logic in their ruin. I knew how to analyze empty spaces. I knew how to compartmentalize structural failure. I did not intend to play the weeping victim, nor did I expect to be rescued from this arrangement. This was a ledger being balanced, a debt being paid in full. I would accept the isolation because the alternative was watching my family's remaining honor be auctioned off for scrap. Pendleton nodded smoothly, satisfied with the clinical efficiency of the moment. He turned the heavy vellum pages of the marital contract, aligning the bottom edge perfectly with the edge of the desk. He unscrewed the cap of a heavy gold fountain pen and extended it toward Julian. If you would, Mr. Thorn, signatures on the bottom line, and initials on every page detailing the property boundaries. Julian reached out. As his fingers closed around the polished barrel of the pen, I noticed it. It was A tiny, fleeting thing, something no one else in the room would have caught if they weren't watching him with the desperate, hyper-vigilant observation of a stranger trapped in his home. His hand trembled, just once. A slight, almost imperceptible tremor that traveled from his knuckles up to his wrist. Julian immediately set his jaw, his expression hardening into absolute granite. He dropped his wrist, using his left hand to adjust his heavy gold cufflink with a sharp, precise tug. It was a masterful correction, a seamless disguise of a physiological crack in his armor. He did not look up. He did not acknowledge the hesitation. He simply pressed the nib of the pen to the paper and signed his name in sharp, aggressive strokes that nearly tore through the vellum. He slid the document across the mahogany table toward me. I stared at his signature. The ink was still wet, pooling slightly in the loops of his name. I reached out and took the pen. The metal was still warm from his grip. I did not tremble. I did not hesitate. I signed my name neatly, deliberately, sealing myself inside the cold, distant geometry of the estate he had drawn around us. When it was over, Julian stood. He did not offer his hand. He did not offer a meaningless platitude or a false welcome to his home. He simply buttoned his suit jacket, gave Pendleton a curt nod, and walked out of the library, taking his signature winter fragrance with him. The heavy oak doors clicked shut, leaving behind a silence that was mine. Quiet, like a held breath that no one dared to release. 3 months passed. Morning came quietly, every day following the same rigid, silent pattern. No trumpets, no shift in the universe. Just a pale beam of coastal light slipping through the tall, drafty windows of the guest wing, brushing against the stone floors like a second thought. True to the letter of our signed agreement, the guest wing was entirely mine, and entirely separate. It was a beautiful, sterile sanctuary. The walls were lined with dark walnut paneling, and the furniture was heavy, antique, and immaculately preserved. But it was freezing. The heating system in Thorn Manor was a relic of a bygone century, and the ocean winds battered the western exposure with relentless hostility. I spent my days and evenings wrapped in thick wool sweaters, losing myself in my work to avoid the echoing emptiness of the house. I had brought several large archival boxes with me, filled with historical documents regarding the region's architecture. It was a tedious, solitary task, but it gave my mind a place to anchor itself when the isolation became too loud. On a particularly gray Tuesday evening, the temperature inside the guest wing had plummeted drastically. I sat at a small, worn wooden desk pushed near the window, a single brass reading lamp, casting a warm circle of light over my workspace. Spread across the desk were the blueprints. They were original, hand-drawn architectural plans of Thorn Manor, dated over a century ago. The paper was incredibly fragile, yellowed at the edges and smelling of dry dust and old ink. I ran my fingers lightly over the precise, pencil-drawn grid lines. I found comfort in the rigid structure of the drawing. Certain ancient spaces possess a gravity, all their own, pulling you into their history, without making a single sound. Looking at the exact measurements of the stone foundation, the thickness of the retaining walls, and the calculated slope of the roof, I felt a strange kinship with the men who had built this fortress. They had understood the necessity of keeping the world out. I traced the line of the main hallway with my index finger, dragging it slowly toward the western elevation. There, neatly labeled in a cursive hand, was the wing I currently occupied. I measured the scale with my eyes. The distance between my desk and the master suite on the far east side of the estate was nearly 300 feet. 300 feet of empty corridors, locked doors, and cold marble floors. Julian and I existed like ghosts, haunting opposite ends of a graveyard. We occasionally passed each other in the grand foyer or the formal dining room, but we rarely spoke. When we did, it was entirely logistical. He was a ghost of a man, walled off by trauma I was not permitted to ask about, working late into the night in his study, leaving early in the morning before the fog lifted. As I studied the cross-section of the estate's chimney flues, the heavy glass of the window pane beside me rattled violently. I paused, lifting my head. The sound of the ocean had changed. It was no longer the steady, rhythmic crash of waves against the rocks. It was a deep, guttural roar. The barometric pressure in the room seemed to drop suddenly, making my ears pop. The sky outside the window was no longer gray. It had bruised into a dark, violent purple, heavy with the threat of a massive coastal storm. The local radio in the kitchen had been issuing warnings all afternoon. A low-pressure system moving in violently off the Pacific, bringing gale-force winds. I pulled my wool sweater tighter around my shoulders, shivering as a draft of icy air seeped through the century-old window casings. A soft, rhythmic clicking echoed from the hallway outside my sitting room. I recognized the sound immediately. It was the low, steady wheel of the silver tea cart. I left my desk, walking softly across the Persian rug to the heavy door that separated my sitting room from the main corridor. I opened it just as Martha Hayes came to a stop. Martha was the estate's head housekeeper, a woman in her late 60s who moved with quiet efficiency and observed everything through sharp, empathetic eyes. She managed the immense logistical burden of Thorn Manor effortlessly, but she, too, was bound by the unspoken rules of the house. She stood in the corridor, her hands resting on the handle of the tea cart. Between us on the floor lay a literal brass threshold, a thin strip of metal set into the hardwood that marked the exact architectural boundary between the main house and the guest wing. Martha did not step over it. "Good evening, Mrs. Thorne," Martha said quietly, her voice barely carrying over the rising howl of the wind outside. "Good evening, Martha," I replied, offering her a small, tight smile. "You don't have to call me that when it's just us." Martha gave a slight dismissive shake of her head, maintaining her professional distance, though her eyes were kind. She reached down to the cart and lifted a small tray. On it sat a rustic ceramic mug. It was a heavy, slightly chipped piece of stoneware that looked entirely out of place among the pristine silver of the estate, but it was filled with a steaming pour of chamomile and ginger tea, accompanied by a small plate of shortbread cookies. She knelt slightly and placed the tray on a small wooden side table situated exactly on the boundary line. Not 1 inch into my quarters. Not 1 inch into the main house. It was a physical manifestation of the contract I had signed. "The storm is picking up faster than they predicted," Martha said, straightening her apron. "Mr. Thorne has ordered the external storm shutters closed on the lower levels. The staff is being sent home early before the coastal roads wash out. I will be leaving within the hour." I looked at the dark windows at the end of the hall, watching the rain begin to lash horizontally against the glass. The isolation was about to become absolute. "Be careful on the roads, Martha," I said softly. "Don't worry about me. I have my work." "Make sure you stay away from the western windows, ma'am," she advised, her brow creasing slightly. "The wind off the cliff face can be punishing. There are extra blankets in the cedar chest at the foot of your bed if the heating fails." "Thank you. Truly." She gave a small nod, turning the tea cart around. I stood in the doorway and watched her walk back down the long, shadowed corridor, the wheels clicking softly until she turned the corner and vanished into the depths of the east wing. I looked down at the tray resting on the boundary line. Steam rose from the heavy stoneware, a fragile ribbon of warmth, fighting against the freezing draft of the hallway. I stepped forward, my slippers crossing the metal divider for just a second to retrieve the tray. The fragile vessel was wonderfully warm against my freezing palms, a stark contrast to the numbing cold of the stone estate. I carried it back into my sitting room and pulled the heavy door shut, twisting the iron lock until it clicked into place. I carried the tea back to my desk, setting it down carefully beside the drafted vellum. I took a sip of the pale, fragrant chamomile and ginger blend, wrapping both my hands firmly around the heated cup to steal every last fraction of its heat. The wind howled again, a high-pitched, mournful sound that rattled the bones of the house. I sat alone in the dim light of the brass lamp, tracing the foundations of a house built to withstand anything, wondering how long it would take for the cold to finally settle in my bones. I was perfectly safe, I was perfectly secure, and I had never felt more completely unmoored in my entire life. This story doesn't rush. It lingers in quiet rooms, between unfinished words, in the spaces where love is found without being spoken. But as the storm outside began to batter the stone walls of Thorn Manor, tearing leaves from the ancient oak trees that loomed over the guest wing, I realized that some boundaries were not meant to last. I took another slow sip of the tea, watching the shadows dance across the faded architectural lines, unaware that the quiet isolation I had just accepted was about to be violently shattered. The storm did not arrive all at once. It gathered its strength in the dark, pressing against the stone exterior of Thorn Manor with a heavy, suffocating weight. I sat perfectly still at my desk, my hands curled tightly around the cooling clay, feeling the last remnants of heat leach away into the frigid air of the guest wing. The chamomile tea had grown bitter and cold, but I did not let go. It was the only thing tethering me to the present moment, the only anchor in a room that suddenly felt entirely too large and far too fragile. Outside the rattling window panes, the Pacific Northwest gale was no longer just a sound. It was a physical entity. It howled with a deep, guttural ferocity, tearing through the ancient oak trees that lined the western cliff edge. I could hear massive branches groaning under the immense atmospheric pressure, their thick wooden joints protesting against the violent wind. I was an archivist. I understood the limits of timber and stone. I knew exactly how much sheer force a century-old structure could withstand before the mortar began to fail. And as the floorboards beneath my feet began to vibrate with a low, terrifying frequency, I realized the math was no longer in our favor. The single brass reading lamp on my desk flickered once, a pathetic stutter of yellow light, before dying completely. The darkness that swallowed the room was absolute, heavy, and instantaneous. It was the kind of blackness that pressed against your eyelids, disorienting and absolute. I did not scream. I merely set the cold mug down on the edge of the wood, my ears straining against the roar of the ocean outside. For a fraction of a second, the wind seemed to draw a massive, holding breath. The silence in that tiny gap was worse than the noise. It was the terrifying vacuum before a collapse. Then, the world tore open. The sound was deafening, a violent explosion of splintering wood and shattering stone that vibrated directly through my teeth. It did not come from the window. It came from directly above. The ceiling of the guest wing groaned, a sickening sound of structural failure, before the plaster simply gave way. A massive ancient branch from the oldest oak on the property had snapped, driven by the gale force winds like a battering ram straight through the slate roof. I threw my arms over my head, diving sideways off the wooden chair, just as a torrent of freezing rain, heavy wet plaster, and jagged wooden lath crashed down exactly where I had been sitting. The sheer physical shock of the impact knocked the breath from my lungs. I hit the Persian rug hard, my shoulder slamming into the heavy leg of a nearby armchair. Dust and debris exploded outward, immediately turned into a heavy, suffocating mud by the sheer volume of water pouring through the breached ceiling. The guest wing was gone. In the span of 3 seconds, my isolated, sterile sanctuary had been reduced to an open wound exposed to the violent coastal storm. The icy deluge poured down from the black hole above. It was a freezing waterfall that instantly soaked through my thick wool sweater, chilling my skin with the brutal bite of the Pacific winter. The wind howled through the new opening, a triumphant mocking sound that scattered remnants of the plaster across the floor. I gasped, pushing myself up onto my hands and knees, fighting through the disorientation and the stinging debris in my eyes. My first instinct was not to run toward the safety of the main corridor. It was not to call for help. Through the heavy curtain of freezing rain, my eyes adjusted to the dim, ambient light of the storm outside, and I saw the desk. The desk where I had left the delicate, century-old documents. The hand-drawn architectural plans that belonged to this estate. The heritage I had sworn to archive and protect. Panic, sharp and absolute, finally pierced through my disciplined exterior. I did not care about the antique furniture, or my clothes, or the few pieces of modest jewelry I kept in the dresser. I scrambled forward over the slippery, ruined floorboards, my wet skirt clinging heavily to my legs. The cold was a physical agony, biting into my bare hands as I shoved aside heavy pieces of broken roofing slate. I reached the edge of the desk just as a second wave of water cascaded through the broken rafters. I threw my upper body over the worn wood, shielding the fragile paper with my own back. My fingers, numb and clumsy from the freezing rain, desperately gathered the edges of the historical plans. The paper was already damp, threatening to dissolve into pulp beneath my touch. I rolled the large sheets together with frantic precision, sliding them into the thick, waterproof leather folio I always kept at the corner of my workspace. I pulled the heavy folio to my chest, curling my body around it like a protective shell, and sank to the floor beside the desk. I was completely drenched. The water soaking my clothes was paralyzing. A deep, bone-itching cold that caused my teeth to chatter violently. I sat in the darkness, surrounded by the wreckage of my mandated isolation, the wind tearing at my wet hair. I had followed every rule. I had accepted the boundaries, and the sky had simply decided to tear them down. Through the roar of the storm, a new sound cut through the darkness. It was a heavy, metallic thud, followed by the screech of iron hinges protesting against an immense weight. The heavy door that separated the guest sitting room from the main corridor, swollen with the sudden drop in temperature and dampness, was being forced open. A blinding beam of light sliced through the curtain of falling rain and plaster dust, sweeping across the ruined room before snapping directly onto me. I squinted against the harsh glare, raising one trembling hand to shield my eyes, my other arm still locked fiercely around the leather folio. Standing in the doorway was Julian Thorne. He did not look like the pristine, unreadable tycoon who had sat across from me in the library 3 months ago. His dark hair was windblown and damp, sticking to his forehead. He had shed his suit jacket, wearing only a heavy, oversized wool overcoat over a simple charcoal sweater. In the harsh backscatter of the flashlight, he looked entirely like the rugged, unforgiving coastal cliff his house was built upon. He was immovable, intense, and terrifyingly present. My husband stepped into the ruined room. He did not hesitate, nor did he look up at the massive hole in his roof or the thousands of dollars of antique furniture currently drowning in rain. His gaze remained locked entirely on me. He crossed the debris-strewn floor with long, urgent strides, the water splashing against his heavy leather boots. I expected anger. I expected the clinical frustration of a man whose property had been damaged. I braced myself for a reprimand, clutching the folio tighter, my jaw rigid to hide my violent shivering. He dropped the heavy flashlight onto the one dry corner of a side table, casting the room in sharp, angled shadows. He dropped to one knee beside me, the freezing water immediately soaking through the thick fabric as of his trousers. He did not flinch. Julian reached out, his large hands hovering for a fraction of a second, before gently gripping my upper arms. His touch was firm, but surprisingly careful, a silent question, checking for broken bones or bleeding wounds. He looked at my face, pale and dripping with icy rain, and then his eyes dropped to the thick leather folio I was crushing against my chest. He understood instantly. He saw that I had thrown myself under a collapsing ceiling not to save myself, but to protect the history of his family's home. A complex, heavy emotion crossed his face. It was a sudden softening of the granite, a crack in the winter stone. It vanished as quickly as it appeared, replaced by a fierce, undeniable protectiveness. Without a single word, the owner of the estate let go of my arms and stood up. He unbuttoned his heavy overcoat, shrugging it off his broad shoulders in one fluid motion. He knelt back down and draped the massive garment over my shivering frame. The relief was instantaneous and overwhelming. The coat was lined with thick, dry fleece, and it retained the profound, radiating heat of his body. But more than the warmth, it was the scent that anchored me. The heavy, enveloping fragrance of cedarwood, dry winterwood, and a faint hint of peppermint completely blocked out the smell of wet earth and plaster. It was the scent of safety. It was the scent of the man I had agreed to avoid. I clutched the lapels of his coat with trembling fingers, my throat incredibly tight. I looked up at him, the rain still falling around us, finding his dark eyes in the dim light. He reached out again, his hand pausing just inches from my cheek. Sometimes love doesn't knock, it waits. It waits for the artificial walls to fall, for the contracts to wash away in the rain, leaving nothing but the raw, unpolished truth of two people alone in the dark. He did not touch my face. Instead, he gripped my elbow, his thumb pressing gently against the heavy wool of the coat he had just given me. His strength was grounding, an immovable anchor in the center of the chaotic storm. He pulled me upward, helping me to my feet, his body naturally shifting to block the wind tearing through the broken ceiling. "You're freezing," he said. His voice was a low, rough murmur, barely audible over the howling wind, but it reverberated through my chest with absolute clarity. It was not a command. It was an observation layered with a quiet, furious concern that I had never heard from him before. "The documents," I stammered, my teeth clicking together despite the warmth of the coat. The architectural plans. I saved them, but the rest of the boxes. I looked back at the corner of the room, where my other archival materials were stacked. The water was creeping toward them, threatening months of meticulous labor. I moved to step away from him, to gather the heavy cardboard crates, but his hand tightened slightly on my elbow, stopping me. "Leave them," Julian commanded softly. "I will get them. You are not staying in this room another second." Before I could argue, he stepped past me. The man who possessed enough wealth to hire an army of staff, to do his bidding, waded into the freezing water himself. He hoisted the 2 heaviest archival boxes into his arms with effortless strength, balancing them perfectly against his hip. He turned back to me, nodding toward the open door. "Walk, Clara?" he urged, using my given name for the first time since the day we signed the papers in the library. The sound of it on his lips felt entirely foreign, lacking the cold formality I had grown accustomed to. It was a lifeline thrown into the dark. I did not argue. I clutched the leather folio in one hand and the heavy collar of his cedarwood-scented coat in the other, and I walked. I navigated the slippery, ruined floorboards, stepping over chunks of plaster and shattered roofing slates, moving toward the hallway, where his flashlight cast a long, steady beam of safety. We stepped out of the guest sitting room and into the main corridor. The difference in temperature was immediate, though the air in the hall was still biting cold. The wind howled furiously behind us, a constant reminder of the violence we had just escaped. Julian walked close beside me, his tall frame shielding me from the draft, the heavy archival boxes resting securely in his arms. We walked down the long, shadowed expanse of the west wing, the only sound the rhythmic thud of his boots, and the soft squelch of my ruined slippers. We did not speak. The silence between us had completely transformed. It was no longer the teeth-baring, suffocating quiet of the library. It was a shared, haze-heavy stillness, thick with the adrenaline of the narrow escape and the startling realization of our sudden proximity. As we approached the center of the house, my pace naturally slowed. I looked down at the floor, the beam of the flashlight illuminating the polished hardwood beneath our feet. A few paces ahead lay the dividing threshold. It was the exact architectural boundary dictated by our binding arrangement. It was the physical line I had sworn never to cross without explicit invitation. I stopped. My frozen fingers tightened instinctively on the wet leather of my folio. My mind, trained to respect strict parameters and structural rules, hesitated. I looked up at the man standing beside me in the dim light. He was soaked, carrying my burdens, and looking at me with an intensity that made the storm outside feel insignificant. Julian did not ask why I had stopped. He followed my gaze down to the thin strip of metal set into the floor. He understood exactly what it represented. He understood the legal prison he had built for us, the rigid walls of separation he had demanded to protect his own traumatized isolation. He shifted the heavy boxes in his arms, his jaw setting into a hard, determined line. He did not recite a clause. He did not ask for my consent to void the agreement. He simply stepped over the thin floor marker, completely obliterating the boundary. He turned back to me, extending his free hand. His palm was broad, calloused, and steady. He did not demand that I take it. He merely offered it, a silent invitation to leave the cold, transactional reality of the guest wing behind and step into his world. I stared at his outstretched hand. I thought of the freezing rain, the shattered ceiling, and the absolute solitude I had endured for 3 months. I thought of the heavy, intoxicating warmth of the coat currently draped over my shoulders. I did not look back at the ruin of my sanctuary. I reached out and placed my trembling fingers into his palm. His grip closed around my hand, warm and incredibly solid, sending a jolt of heat straight through my frozen veins. He gently pulled me forward, guiding me over the metallic boundary and into the east wing. The moment my feet crossed the line, a profound psychological shift settled over me. The contract was physically voided. The separation was broken. We walked the remaining distance in silence, his hand never leaving mine, the grip steady and grounding, as we moved deeper into the heart of the ancient stone estate. We reached the solid timber double doors of his private master suite. Julian pushed them open with his shoulder, and a wave of glorious, dry heat washed over my shivering body. The room was expansive, lined with rich mahogany bookshelves and heavy, velvet curtains that completely blocked out the furious storm. But the focal point was the massive stone hearth at the center of the room, where a large fire was already roaring, casting a brilliant dancing amber light across the floor. He led me toward the fire, finally releasing my hand to set the heavy archival boxes down on a thick woven rug. I stood near the flames, the intense heat immediately going to work on my soaked skirt and freezing skin. I pulled his heavy overcoat tighter around myself, inhaling the deep scent of cedarwood. Entirely overwhelmed by the sudden transition from absolute ruin to perfect, unyielding sanctuary, Julian turned to face me, the firelight catching the sharp angles of his face, softening the winter stone into something remarkably human. He reached up, his fingers brushing a wet strand of hair away from my cheek, with a touch so fragile it felt like an apology. "You're safe here," he whispered, his voice vibrating with a quiet, absolute vow that stripped away every defense I had left. "You're never going back to that room." His vow hung in the air, heavier than the rain battering the tall, reinforced windows of the East Wing. I stood frozen on the thick woven rug, my mind struggling to reconcile the absolute certainty in his voice with the clinical, distant man who had signed our marriage covenant 3 months ago. The water from my ruined skirt dripped steadily onto the hearthstone, hissing violently as it met the intense, radiating heat of the fire. I was a trespasser in his sanctuary, tracking the wreckage of the storm into a room that had been strictly forbidden to me. Julian did not look at the muddy water, pooling on his pristine hardwood floor. He did not issue a single reprimand or calculate the damage to his expensive rugs. Instead, he stepped away from the fireplace, crossing the expansive room toward a massive, dark wood armoire built into the far wall. His movements were precise, completely devoid of the frantic adrenaline that still made my own hands shake uncontrollably. He opened the heavy double doors and reached inside, retrieving a thick, charcoal gray cashmere sweater and a pair of soft flannel trousers. He walked back to me, holding the dry garments out. He kept a deliberate, highly respectful distance, ensuring his knuckles did not brush against my skin as I reached out to take them. "There is a bathroom through that door," my husband said quietly, gesturing to a frosted glass panel on the right side of the master suite. "The floors are heated. Leave your wet things on the tiles. Take as much time as you need." I looked down at the dry clothes in my hands. They were massive, utterly impractical for my smaller frame, but they represented a profound physical salvation. I nodded, entirely incapable of forcing a single word of gratitude past the tight, painful knot in my throat. I turned and walked into the adjoining room, pushing the heavy glass door shut until the latch clicked softly into place. The bathroom was a continuation of the same dark, masculine architecture that defined the rest of his private quarters. It was a study in slate tiles, brushed brass fixtures, and the pervasive, clean, sharp notes of winter wood and peppermint. True to his word, the dark stone floor radiated a glorious, steady warmth against my freezing bare feet. I set his clothes on the dry marble vanity and began the slow, painful process of peeling off the soaked, heavy layers of my ruined dress. The fabric was caked with wet plaster dust and splinters of roofing lath, clinging to my skin like a second layer of ice. As it fell to the floor, I felt as though I was shedding the armor of the debt-bound bride I had been forced to become. I turned on the brass faucet, letting the hot water run over my numb fingers until the stinging sensation faded into a dull throb. I washed the grime from my hands and face, then reached for the clothes he had provided. The cashmere sweater fell past my thighs, the heavy sleeves so long I had to roll the cuffs up several times, just to free my hands. The fabric was incredibly soft, smelling faintly of the same winter wood that clung to his overcoat. It was an overwhelming sensory envelope. Even standing in a separate room, I was entirely wrapped in him, protected by the physical barrier of his own clothes. When I finally emerged from the bathroom, the master suite had subtly shifted. The storm outside continued its violent, relentless assault, the wind howling against the coastal cliffs, but the atmosphere inside the room was profoundly still. Julian had also changed. He wore a simple, dark Henley shirt and dry canvas trousers, his dark hair towel-dried, but still slightly unruly from the rain. He was standing by a small, polished mahogany credenza, near the tall windows, his broad back to me. A quiet, rhythmic hum filled the space, cutting gently through the crackle of the fireplace. He was boiling water in a sleek silver kettle. I walked back to the hearth, moving silently in my bare feet, and sank down onto the thick, dry rug. I pulled my knees to my chest, closing my eyes and letting the intense heat of the fire bake the remaining chill from my bones. I listened to him work. There was an unexpected domestic grace to his movements. The soft clinking of porcelain, the quiet precision with which he opened a tin. This was a man who commanded boardrooms, who leveled corporate empires with a single signature, and yet he was performing the smallest, most ordinary act of service with absolute, unwavering focus. A few minutes later, Julian crossed the room carrying a small wooden tray. He set it down on the low mahogany table between us, then lowered himself onto the rug opposite me. He did not sit in the heavy leather armchair looking down at me. He chose the floor, placing himself on exactly the same physical plane as I was. It was a subtle, silent surrender of his inherent authority. He picked up one of the steaming cups and held it out across the low table. I uncurled one hand from the oversized sleeve of his sweater and took the porcelain by the handle. I raised it to my lips, bracing myself for the bitter, generic bite of standard black tea. Instead, the steam rising from the surface carried a familiar, highly specific fragrance. I took a slow, cautious sip. The flavor bloomed on my tongue instantly. The soft, calming floral notes of chamomile perfectly balanced by the sharp, grounding heat of raw ginger. I froze, the cup hovering inches from my mouth. I looked down at the pale golden liquid, then across the table, at the man sitting in the flickering firelight. This was not a standard pantry staple. This was a very specific, small-batch artisanal blend. It was the exact tea Martha had been leaving at the brass threshold of my room every single night. I had assumed the housekeeper had simply noticed my preference during my first week in the guest wing and taken it upon herself to order it. But Martha was gone. She had evacuated hours ago before the storm hit. My eyes drifted past Julian's shoulder, landing on the mahogany credenza. Sitting next to the silver kettle was a small, the matte black artisan tin. The label was unmistakable. It was my tea. He kept it here, in his most private room. The realization hit me with the physical force of the falling oak branch. He had not been ignoring me for the past 3 months. He had not been entirely detached, living oblivious to my presence in the house. In the cold, sterile distance dictated by our marriage contract, Julian Thorne had been silently cataloging my habits. He had known exactly what I drank when the coastal draft made my hands ache. He had kept it in his own sanctuary, ensuring it was always available, perhaps even brewing it himself on the nights when Martha was off duty. Not because it was expected, not because it was written in any legal document, but because he was quietly, meticulously paying attention. I lowered the cup to my lap, my fingers tightening around the warm porcelain until my knuckles turned white. The silence between us stretched out, but it was no longer teeth-baring or hostile. It was thick with the weight of unsaid things, vibrating with a profound, terrifying vulnerability. I studied the sharp, stoic lines of his face. The winter stone was cracking, revealing the exhausted, fiercely protective man underneath. "You had it," I whispered, my voice incredibly fragile in the vast, echoing room. I did not need to specify what I meant. Julian looked down at my hands, watching the way I held the cup like a lifeline. He did not offer a polished excuse. He did not deflect or hide behind his usual stoicism. He gave a single, slow nod, his dark eyes rising to meet mine. "I had Pendleton acquire a case of it the week after you moved in," he admitted, his voice a low, rough murmur that barely carried over the crackling fire. "Martha told me you struggled to sleep in the cold. I wanted to make sure you had something to keep you warm when the heating failed." "The contract," I started, the word feeling utterly ridiculous, almost profane in the safety of this fire-lit space. "The contract said we were to maintain complete autonomy. No shared domestic obligations. You weren't supposed to monitor my comfort. The contract," Julian interrupted softly, his gaze locking onto mine with an intensity that made my breath hitch, "was a coward's document." The blunt honesty of his statement stunned me into silence. I sat perfectly still, listening to the violent crash of the ocean waves echoing up the cliffside. The wind shrieked, rattling the heavy glass, but the mahogany bookshelves and thick walls of the master suite absorbed the brunt of the assault. We were inside a fortress, entirely cut off from the rest of the ruined world. Julian leaned forward, resting his forearms on his knees, his large hands clasping loosely together. He stared into the roaring flames, the amber light, casting deep, dancing shadows across his collarbone. The tension in his broad shoulders was palpable, as if he was physically wrestling with an invisible weight. Thorn Manor was built in 1890, he began, his tone shifting into something deeply introspective and heavy with history. My great-grandfather designed it to be impenetrable. Thick stone walls, slate roofs, heavy timber framing. He wanted a house that could withstand the worst the Pacific could throw at it. He wanted to keep his family safe from the elements. I remained silent, holding my breath, instinctively recognizing that any sudden movement might cause him to rebuild his walls. But stone only protects you from the outside. Julian continued, his gaze distant, lost in the shifting embers. It doesn't protect you from what happens inside. When I was 9 years old, a storm identical to this one hit the coast. The wind tore the ancient trees out by their roots. The roads washed out completely. The phone lines snapped under the weight of falling ice. We were completely cut off from the mainland for 5 days. His hands tightened slightly, the knuckles turning pale. I watched the microscopic shift in his posture, the sudden, defensive rigidity of his spine. My mother had caught a fever 2 days before the storm hit, he said, his voice dropping an octave, becoming hollow and brittle. It was supposed to be a minor infection, something easily treated, but without the roads, the doctor couldn't reach us. My father had built an impenetrable fortress, and it became her tomb. We watched her slip away in the bedroom just down the hall, surrounded by millions of dollars of antique furniture, priceless art, and absolutely no way to save her. The tragedy of it settled over the room, heavy and suffocating. I looked at the vast wealth surrounding us, the rare books, the expensive rugs, the flawless architecture, and suddenly, it all looked like an elaborate, beautiful cage. It was a monument to a man's inability to control fate. That is why I drafted the agreement, Clara. Julian looked away from the fire, turning his dark, intense gaze back to me. There was no arrogance left in his expression, no billionaire tycoon demanding obedience. There was only a raw, unguarded fatigue. When your father's creditors began threatening your home, I knew I could solve the financial equation. I could buy the debt. I could offer you the protection of my name. But I also knew that if I brought you into my life, if I allowed myself to actually care for you. He paused, his jaw clenching as he fought for the words, the memories clearly warring with his present reality. Proximity is liability, he finally said, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. If you were close to me, I would eventually fail to protect you. Just like my father failed. So, I built a wall. I had Pendleton draft the legal boundaries. I put 300 feet of empty corridors between us. I thought if I kept you at a distance, I couldn't lose you. I set the teacup down on the wooden tray. The ceramic made a soft final clink in the quiet room. My heart was pounding a slow, heavy rhythm against my ribs. The man I had believed to be a cold, calculating tyrant was nothing more than a terrified boy standing guard over an empty fortress. He hadn't isolated me to punish me. He had isolated me to keep me safe from his own perceived inadequacies. Julian, I breathed, saying his name softly. The sound of it in the quiet room felt like a physical touch, a bridge crossing the chasm he had built. You didn't fail me tonight. You walked into a collapsing room and pulled me out. I shouldn't have had to, he argued, a sudden, fierce self-loathing entering his voice. He shifted closer, closing the small gap between us on the rug until his knees were only inches from mine. I should have moved you out of that wing the moment the barometric pressure dropped. I should have brought you here days ago. I should have never put you in that room to begin with. He reached out, his hand trembling with the exact same imperceptible tremor I had witnessed in the library the day we signed our lives away. But this time, he did not hide it. He did not disguise it by adjusting a gold cufflink or turning his face away. He let the vulnerability exist in the open air. His large, warm palm cupped the side of my face, his thumb gently tracing the delicate line of my jaw. I leaned into his touch instinctively, my eyes fluttering shut as a profound, overwhelming wave of relief washed over me. His skin was rough, calloused from years of silent labor. But his touch was incredibly reverent, as if he was holding something infinitely fragile. I stood in the corridor outside the guest wing. Julian whispered, his face moving closer until I could feel the radiant warmth of his breath against my cheek. 3 weeks ago, it was late. The house was completely silent. I opened my eyes, my breath catching painfully in my throat. I remembered that night perfectly. It was the anniversary of my mother's passing. I had sat on the edge of the antique bed, overwhelmed by the crushing weight of the family debt, the utter isolation of my new life, and the sheer physical exhaustion of holding my dignity together. I had broken down, weeping quietly into my hands in the dark, believing the thick stone walls would absorb the sound and keep my secret safe. I heard you cry. I didn't like it, Julian said, his thumb brushing over my cheekbone. The words slipped from his lips, not as a threat, not as an order, but as a devastating confession of his own helplessness. It took every ounce of discipline I possessed not to break the door down, not to cross that dividing line, and pull you into my arms until you stopped. I stood there in the dark for an hour, hating myself. I realized then that the contract was a failure. It wasn't protecting you. It was just breaking you in a different way. The last defensive wall inside my chest crumbled into dust. The pride, the architectural boundaries, the carefully maintained emotional distance. It all vanished, leaving nothing but the raw, undeniable truth of the man sitting in front of me. I lifted my hands, pushing the oversized sleeves of the cashmere sweater down, and placed my palms flat against his chest. I could feel the rapid, heavy beat of his heart beneath the dark fabric. He wasn't Winterstone. He wasn't a cold tycoon. He was warm, alive, and completely surrendered to the reality of us. "Tell me to stop," Julian murmured, his dark eyes searching mine with a desperate, silent plea for permission. His hand slid from my cheek to the nape of my neck, his fingers threading gently into the damp ends of my hair. He was offering me the power, returning the agency that the transactional world had stolen from me, giving me the choice to rebuild the wall or let it fall forever. "No," I answered, my voice steady, stripped of all hesitation and fear. "Don't stop, don't ever put the wall back up." He exhaled a long, shuddering breath, a sound of absolute surrender, and rested his forehead against mine. We didn't rush. We didn't seek a frantic, desperate physical release. We simply sat there on the rug in front of the roaring fire, the storm raging violently against the glass, while the silence inside the room finally transformed into a permanent sanctuary. I inhaled the deep scent of cedarwood and chamomile, feeling the steady, rhythmic anchor of his heartbeat beneath my hands. The contract was just a piece of paper, ruined and forgotten in a flooded wing. This quiet, shared breath in the darkest hour of the night was the real vow. The transition from the violent, howling nightmare of the storm to the profound stillness of morning felt like surfacing from deep water. I woke slowly, my senses pulling me upward through layers of exhaustion, instinctively bracing for the biting cold of the guest wing. For months, my mornings had been defined by shivering drafts and the damp chill of isolation. But the cold never came. Instead, I was enveloped in a heavy, radiant warmth that sank deep into my bones. I opened my eyes, blinking against the pale, washed-out coastal light, filtering through the tall, leaded glass windows of the east wing. The storm had ravaged the coastline for hours, shaking the very foundation of the estate. But inside this room, everything was remarkably still, anchored by an immovable strength. I was lying in the center of Julian's massive, heavy-timbered bed. I was tangled in thick white linens and a heavy down comforter, the oversized cashmere sweater he had given me, the night before still draped securely over my shoulders. The soft wool felt like a protective shield against my skin, carrying the undeniable scent of him. The air in the master suite was cool and crisp, but the lingering ambient heat from the massive stone hearth kept the chill entirely at bay. The fire from the night before had burned down to a deep, glowing bed of superheated orange embers, casting a faint, warm glow across the dark hardwood floors. I turned my head against the pillow. The fabric smelled faintly of cedarwood, winter air, and the quiet safety of the man who owned it. I pushed myself up onto my elbows, the heavy blanket slipping to my waist. The storm had finally broken. Through the windows, the Pacific sky was no longer a bruised, angry purple. It was a soft, exhausted gray, and the furious, shrieking wind had died down to a dull, rhythmic hum against the cliffside. The ancient stones of the estate had held firm against the barrage, a silent testament to the endurance of this place. I looked across the expansive room. Julian was already awake. He was not wearing a tailored suit, nor was he hidden behind the impenetrable armor of the billionaire tycoon who had purchased my father's debts. He was dressed simply in a dark Henley shirt and canvas trousers, sitting quietly in the heavy leather armchair near the window. He was reading a small, leather-bound book, one hand resting casually against his jaw, his dark hair slightly ruffled from the long night. On the low mahogany table beside him sat a silver tray, holding a large French press of dark coffee and 2 simple ceramic mugs. He didn't look like a man who commanded empires from towering glass boardrooms. He didn't look like the ruthless, unyielding architect of our arrangement who had intimidated my father's creditors into silence. He looked like a man who had finally set down a crushing, invisible weight. I watched him for a long moment, tracing the relaxed line of his broad shoulders and the quiet, steady rhythm of his breathing. The harsh, defensive posture that usually defined him had melted away, leaving behind a man who looked entirely at peace in the quiet morning light. Julian heard the rustle of the heavy linens and looked up. The winter stone of his expression was completely gone, replaced by a quiet, observant softness that made my chest tighten. He set the book down on the table and stood, crossing the room with slow, deliberate steps. He did not rush. He did not crowd my space. He stopped at the edge of the large, woven rug, his hands tucked loosely into his pockets, allowing me all the time I needed to adjust to this new, fragile reality. "You are awake," he said. His voice was a low, resonant rumble, entirely devoid of the clinical detachment that had defined our marriage for the past 3 months. "I am," I replied, my voice slightly raspy from sleep. I pulled my knees to my chest, suddenly hyper-aware of the massive shift in our reality. The strict legal boundary we had lived by was shattered. I was in his private sanctuary, wearing his clothes, occupying his bed. Yet, I did not feel exposed. I did not feel like a commodified asset or a trespasser. I simply felt safe. "The storm passed a few hours ago," Julian offered quietly, gesturing toward the tall windows. "The coastal roads are likely covered in debris, but the worst of the wind is over. I made coffee. Or I can boil water for your tea if you prefer." "Coffee is fine," I murmured, sliding toward the edge of the mattress. My bare feet touched the warm hardwood floor. The contrast to the icy, flooded guest wing was staggering. Here, the floorboards were smooth and heated, carefully maintained and deeply inviting, offering a silent comfort with every step I took. Julian turned back to the small table, plunging the French press with a slow, practiced motion. The rich, dark scent of roasted beans filled the space between us, mingling with the lingering notes of cedarwood and wood smoke. He poured the steaming liquid into the 2 heavy ceramic mugs. He did not summon the kitchen staff. He did not ring a bell or demand service. He simply performed the small, domestic act of service himself, his movements steady and careful. I watched the steam rise from the mugs, swirling into the cool air like tiny, dissipating ghosts. I walked across the room, the oversized sleeves of the cashmere sweater falling past my knuckles, a teat, and accepted the warm mug from his hand. The heat seeped instantly into my cold palms. We stood together by the window, looking out over the rugged coastline. The ocean was still churning, violent and dark, throwing massive white-capped waves against the jagged rocks below. Uprooted branches and torn foliage littered the manicured lawns, a chaotic physical reminder of the violence we had survived. But inside this room, the immediate threat to the estate had passed. The silence between us was no longer a weapon. It was a shared, breathable space, a mutual acknowledgement of the vulnerability we had laid bare in the dark hours of the night. We stood close enough that I could feel the ambient heat radiating from his arm, a steady, grounding presence against the wild backdrop of the Pacific. For the first time since my father's debts had swallowed my life, I felt completely unmoored from the anxiety that had defined my every waking moment. A sharp, polite knock at the thick wooden panels of the master suite suddenly shattered the quiet rhythm of the morning. I froze, my fingers tightening instinctively around the ceramic mug. Julian did not flinch. He simply set his coffee down on the mahogany credenza, his jaw setting into a calm, authoritative line and walked toward the entrance. He pulled the heavy double doors open. Standing in the corridor was Martha Hayes. The head housekeeper looked impeccably put together, her uniform immaculate, though the faint shadows under her sharp eyes betrayed a sleepless night. She held a silver ledger in her hands, her posture rigid with professional urgency. She had survived the evacuation and returned at first light to assess the survival of the estate. "Mr. Thorne," Martha said, her voice brisk and efficient, "I apologize for the intrusion. The main access road is clear enough for emergency vehicles, and I wanted to deliver the damage report immediately." "Proceed, Martha," Julian instructed smoothly, stepping slightly to the side. As he moved, Martha's sharp gaze naturally swept past his shoulder and landed directly on me. I was standing in the center of the master suite, drowning in her employer's dark cashmere, holding a coffee mug, my hair a tangled mess from sleep. For a fraction of a second, the housekeeper's eyes widened. It was a microscopic break in her impeccable professionalism. A sudden, silent realization that the rigid architecture of our transactional union had been completely dismantled overnight. Martha recovered instantly. She did not blink, nor did she offer a single judgment. She simply adjusted her grip on the silver ledger and returned her focus entirely to Julian. "The east wing in the main house suffered only minor superficial damage," Martha reported, her tone perfectly even, consulting her meticulously kept notes. "However, the west guest wing is a catastrophic loss. The structural failure of the roof is total. The old oak branch crushed the main support beams, and the subsequent flooding has ruined the hardwood floors and the majority of the antique furnishings. The room is currently open to the elements. The plaster is dissolving, the antique furniture is splintered, and the structural integrity of that entire side of the house is compromised." I swallowed hard, the memory of the freezing deluge and the collapsing ceiling rushing back in a vivid, terrifying flash. I remembered the deafening crack of the timber overhead, the icy water pouring over the bed where I should have been sleeping, the way the wind had howled like a living creature through the shattered stone walls. If Julian had not crossed the threshold when he did, if he had not pulled me into the safety of the corridor with his own bare hands, I would have been trapped beneath that crushing weight, another forgotten ghost in this massive estate. Martha turned a page in her ledger, the paper snapping sharply in the quiet hall. "I have Arthur Pendleton holding on the telephone in the downstairs study. He has already contacted the insurance adjusters. With your permission, sir, I will call the primary structural contractors in the city right now. We can have an emergency crew out by this afternoon to begin patching the roof before the rot sets into the underlying stone." It was the logical, highly efficient response of a well-managed empire. Fix the damage, repair the boundary, rebuild the wall. I looked down at the dark coffee in my mug, a sudden, heavy dread pooling in the pit of my stomach. The storm was over. The crisis had passed. The practical reality of our arranged marriage was waiting downstairs on the telephone, ready to enforce the rules we had signed in ink. Julian stood perfectly still in the doorway. He looked down at Martha, his expression unreadable, before turning his head slightly to look back at me. His dark eyes locked onto mine across the expansive room. There was no hesitation in his gaze. There was no retreat back into the winter stone. He saw the quiet fear in my posture, the way I had unconsciously curled my fingers tighter around the ceramic mug, and his jaw hardened with a silent, absolute resolve. He wasn't looking at a business asset. He was looking at his wife. "Tell Pendleton to hang up the phone," Julian commanded softly. Martha paused, her pen hovering over the ledger. "Sir?" "Cancel the contractor," Julian repeated, his voice dropping into a low, immovable register. "Do not patch the roof. Do not send a crew into the west wing. Tell the staff to clear the immediate debris so it does not pose a hazard, and then lock the doors." Martha blinked, her professional mask slipping for a second time. "Mr. Thorne, leaving the wing exposed to the coastal weather will result in the total degradation of the western foundation. The financial loss to the property will be immense." "I am aware of the math, Martha," Julian replied quietly. "The wing stays exactly as it is. It remains ruined. Is that understood?" The psychological weight of his decision hung heavily in the quiet air. He was a billionaire who aggressively protected his assets, a man whose entire life was built on calculated preservation and meticulous risk management. Every stone of Thorn Manor had been insured and guarded, and yet he was willingly sacrificing a multi-million-dollar wing of his ancestral home. He was refusing to rebuild the physical boundary that had kept me isolated. He was leaving the shattered room as a permanent physical monument to the death of our separation, allowing the elements to reclaim the space that had caused me so much pain. Martha looked at Julian, then looked past him to me. A faint, knowing warmth finally softened the sharp corners of her eyes. She closed the silver ledger with a soft click. Understood. Mr. Thorne, the narcissist said, a distinct note of quiet approval in her voice. Shall I have the kitchen staff prepare breakfast for 2 in the formal dining room? No, Julian answered, his gaze returning to me. We will take our meals here, right away, sir. Martha offered a deep, respectful nod, turning on her heel and walking away down the long, shadowed corridor, leaving the broken rules of the estate far behind her. Julian pulled the sturdy bedroom doors shut, the iron latch sliding into place with a definitive, satisfying thud. He did not immediately walk back to the coffee tray. Instead, he crossed the room toward the massive stone hearth where the leather folio I had risked my life to save was resting on a low wooden bench. He unbuckled the thick, waterproof straps of the folio and folded the cover back. Inside, the antique drawings were completely safe, the ancient, yellowed paper perfectly dry and preserved. I let out a long, shaky breath of relief, stepping closer to inspect the archival documents that meant so much to my work and my connection to this place. But Julian did not stop at the architectural plans. He reached beneath the rolled blueprints and withdrew a thick, dark, leather binder that had been tucked into the very bottom of the case. It was my copy of the legal document. I had kept it stored folio for reference, a constant reminder of the transactional reality of my life. The waterproof leather of the folio had protected the blueprints, but the freezing rain that had soaked my clothes had seeped downward into the bottom of the bag. The heavy vellum pages of the contract were completely waterlogged. The thick, expensive paper was warped and swollen, and the precise clinical ink of Arthur Pendleton's carefully drafted clauses had run, bleeding across the pages like a dark, ugly bruise. Julian held the ruined document in his hands. He stared down at the blackened, smeared ink, his jaw tightening as he read the distorted remnants of the rules he had forced upon us. Clause 4, subsection B, Julian murmured, his voice laced with a heavy, quiet disgust as he traced the warped edge of the leather cover. Complete physical autonomy. 3,000 square feet of marble and mahogany designed to keep you invisible. It kept you safe, I reminded him softly, standing just a few feet away. It kept me isolated, he corrected, his dark eyes rising to meet mine. It kept me terrified. He turned toward the fireplace. The massive roaring flames from the night before had burned down to a deep, glowing bed of superheated orange embers. The heat radiating from the stones was intense, a sharp, comforting contrast to the freezing deluge that had nearly claimed my life just hours ago. Without a single second of hesitation, Julian tossed the heavy leather binder directly into the heart of the embers. I gasped softly, taking a step forward. We stood side by side in the quiet stillness of the master suite, watching the physical manifestation of my father's debt and my own commodification meet the fire. The heat was absolute. The warped leather cover immediately began to smoke, curling inward with a sharp, hissing crackle that echoed loudly in the quiet room. The thick vellum pages caught fire, the edges turning a brilliant, angry orange, before collapsing into fragile black ash. The elaborate legal jargon, the restrictive clauses drafted by Arthur Pendleton, the signatures we had pressed into the page with cold, trembling hands, all of it was being rapidly consumed. We watched in silence as the rigid legal parameters of my life simply melted away. The boundaries, the stipulations, the transactional reality that had bound me to this cold estate. All of it was being reduced to smoke, pulled up the chimney, and scattered into the gray coastal sky. The scent of burning leather and melting wax filled the room, replacing the sterile memory of the lawyer's office with the raw, tangible warmth of the present. I didn't stay because I owed him. I didn't stay because the contract demanded it. I stayed because, for the first time in my life, the door was open, and I simply didn't want to leave. The immense, crushing weight of my family's financial ruin, the shame of being auctioned off to satisfy a ledger, finally evaporated in the heat of the fire. Julian reached out about his large, warm hand, finding mine in the space between us. He didn't grip my fingers with possessive force. He simply laced his fingers through mine, offering a steady, quiet anchor. "There are no more clauses, Clara," he said quietly, watching the last piece of the leather binding split and turn to ash in the flames. His thumb brushed gently against the pulse point of my wrist, a silent, reverent vow. "Write the life you want. I'll meet you there." I leaned into his side, resting my head against the solid, immovable warmth of his shoulder. He wrapped his arm around me naturally, holding me against him as the last embers of the contract flickered and died, leaving only the soft glow of the remaining coals. The winter stone had finally shattered, leaving only the fierce, unyielding devotion of a man who had chosen to dismantle his own fortress, just to let me in. Some places don't wait to be found. They call to you in silence. Looking around the warm, cedar-scented room, feeling the steady beat of his heart against my ribs, I realized that the sterile luxury of Thorn Manor had never been a home. It had only ever been a building, a beautiful, lonely monument to his past. But the man standing beside me, holding my hand in the quiet aftermath of the storm, was a sanctuary I never wanted to leave. Home isn't a place or a name, it's a person. If this story brought peace to your evening, please consider giving it a like and subscribing to sit with us again. Take a breath and sleep well.